Sometimes a person does not disappear. Their name does. In the early hours of the morning, when the city was still glowing with artificial light and unanswered messages, the news arrived with a quiet finality. A young star had fallen. The official explanation was brief, clinical, and painfully ordinary. An accident, a night of drinking, a tragic misstep, a closed case. But for those who had followed him, who had watched his rise from obscurity to prominence, something felt profoundly wrong. Not because death itself was unbelievable, but because what followed did not resemble mourning. There were no echoes, no lingering presence, only absence. Within hours, his digital footprint began to fracture. A name once typed millions of times a day no longer returned the same results. Profiles appeared altered. Rankings reshuffled themselves without explanation. It was as if the systems that once amplified his existence had quietly agreed to forget him. At first, people assumed it was a glitch. Platforms fail. Algorithms stumble. Errors happen. That explanation was comforting because it was familiar. It allowed grief to remain simple. But as the hours turned into days, the pattern became harder to ignore. Every attempt to restore what had been lost met the same invisible resistance. Polite replies, vague assurances, conversations that ended without answers. This was not chaos. It was order. Those closest to him described a different man than the one implied by the headlines. He was gentle, trusting to a fault. A person who valued loyalty more than caution, and friendship more than leverage. In an industry that rewards sharp edges, he remained disarmingly soft. That softness, some would later suggest, made him vulnerable. In the weeks leading up to his death, subtle changes had begun to surface. His appearances grew less frequent. When he did appear, something about him seemed strained. His movements slower, his smile delayed. In one recording, his steps appeared uneven, as if each one required intention. In another, his hand briefly brushed his face, wiping away something that looked uncomfortably like tears. No one spoke about it then. Silence, after all, is the most efficient survival instinct. As the public struggled to reconcile the man they remembered with the narrative they were given, a deeper unease settled in. This was no longer about how he died. It was about why every trace of him seemed to be dissolving in real time. Why questions were redirected instead of answered. Why curiosity itself appeared to trigger resistance. Grief usually invites memory. This situation punished it. And so, people began to look closer. Not at the fall, but at the aftermath. Not at the explanation, but at the omissions. They noticed numbers, symbols, small details that had once seemed meaningless. A shirt, a date, a sequence that refused to align with coincidence. Individually, these details meant nothing. Together, they formed something far more unsettling. A suggestion that his final days were not defined by randomness, but by pressure. Not by a single moment, but by a slow and deliberate narrowing of space. What we are about to examine is not a theory of death. It is a record of disappearance, a study of how a person can be present one moment and systematically erase the next without a single official declaration. Because what followed his death was not grief. It was erasure. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a statement or an announcement. It came from absence. When people searched for his profile, they found something unfamiliar. The name was still there, but it looked altered. Characters appeared where letters once stood. The familiar rhythm of his identity had been replaced by something cold and arbitrary, as if a machine had been instructed to speak in fragments. At first, no one panicked. Digital systems malfunction every day. Accounts glitch. Databases refresh. These things are mundane, almost boring. Grief prefers explanations that do not demand confrontation. But this was not an isolated failure. As fans navigated through rankings, charts, and recommendation lists, they noticed another irregularity. His name no longer appeared where it statistically should have been. Not lower, not displaced, simply gone. Entire categories behaved as though he had never existed. People began documenting what they saw. Screenshots circulated quietly at first, then with urgency. The pattern was consistent. The more attention the disappearance attracted, the more complete it became. In response, his supporters did what audiences have learned to do in the digital age. They engaged the system on its own terms. They interacted. They sent virtual tokens of support. Millions of symbolic gestures accumulated. Each one meant to say the same thing. He was still remembered. By the platform's own published rules, this level of engagement triggered visibility. Certain thresholds unlocked recognition. Others granted promotional placement. The math was straightforward, unemotional and transparent. Yet nothing happened. No update followed. No acknowledgement appeared. The system accepted the input, but refused the output. It was as though the rules themselves had been suspended without notice. Frustration turned into inquiry. Inquiry turned into insistence. People reached out to customer service channels, expecting clarification. What they received instead was language carefully stripped of meaning. The replies were polite, professional, identical. Each response acknowledged the message without addressing the question. Each concluded with gratitude, as if appreciation could substitute explanation. When pressed for specifics, the wording did not change. It simply repeated itself, like a recorded message looping in an empty room. Some users pushed further. They asked for documentation, for criteria, for a reason that could be examined rather than absorbed. At that point, conversations ended abruptly. Sessions were closed. The silence returned. What unsettled people was not the refusal itself. It was the uniformity of it. There was no contradiction between responses, no accidental honesty, no deviation in tone. This was not confusion. It was coordination, and coordination implies intent. As the digital footprint continued to erode, another detail surfaced. His name had not merely been removed from visible rankings. It had been scrubbed from historical listings as well. Records that once preserved past data now reflected a revised version of events, one in which his presence had been minimized to the point of irrelevance. This raised a troubling question. Technical issues do not retroactively edit history. We began to understand that we were not witnessing a breakdown. We were witnessing a process. In the modern world, erasure does not require force. It requires access. A few adjustments to visibility. A few quiet parameters changed behind interfaces most users never see. The result is the same. A person becomes harder to find, then harder to remember, then optional. Those who noticed this progression described a growing sense of unease. It felt less like an investigation and more like watching a door close in slow motion. Each attempt to intervene was acknowledged, recorded, and then neutralized. There were no warnings, no alerts, just the steady disappearance of reference points. What made the situation especially disturbing was how ordinary it looked from the outside. No alarm sounded, no rules were visibly broken. Everything functioned as designed, which meant that somewhere this outcome had been accounted for. As days passed, people began to ask a different kind of question. Not how this was happening, but why it felt familiar. Why the language used to deflect concern sounded rehearsed. Why curiosity itself seemed to trigger containment. The conclusion many reached was quiet, but unavoidable. This was not a failure of communication. It was a boundary. Once that realization set in, the story shifted. The disappearance of his name was no longer an anomaly to be corrected. It was a message being delivered, carefully and without noise. And that was the moment people realized this was no longer a technical issue. Every disappearance leaves behind a smaller circle of people who were close enough to feel it before anyone else did. In this case, that circle narrowed quickly, until one name remained at its center. He was not a manager, not a rival, not an outsider. He was a friend. Those who knew them described their relationship as uncomplicated. They shared meals, traded advice, spoke openly about work and pressure. In an environment built on performance and leverage, their connection appeared disarmingly ordinary. That was what made it dangerous. According to individuals familiar with their interactions, the request came quietly. There was no urgency, no threat, just an opportunity, a chance to invest, a promise framed as certainty. The sum was substantial, but not unimaginable for someone at his level. The return, he was told, was nearly guaranteed. What mattered was not the money itself. It was the trust that carried it. He was known for believing people when they spoke with confidence. He valued relationships over contracts, intention over paperwork. That disposition had served him well in friendships, but it left him exposed when those friendships began to fracture. Once the money changed hands, the narrative shifted. The investment produced no updates. Weeks passed, then months. When questions surfaced, they were met with reassurance. Delays were explained away. Timelines extended. Nothing appeared overtly wrong, only incomplete. Still, unease grew. Eventually, the signs became impossible to ignore. The man who had spoken of restraint now displayed abundance. A new car appeared. Then, a new residence. Luxury that arrived without explanation, carried with casual indifference. When confronted, the response was not defensive, it was dismissive. The loan, he claimed, had never existed. What followed was not an argument but a reversal. Conversations ended. Messages went unanswered. Mutual acquaintances withdrew, not with hostility but with caution. It was as if proximity itself had become risky. This was the moment isolation took shape. In industries governed by perception, silence is rarely accidental. When people stop asking questions simultaneously, it suggests an unspoken consensus. Not agreement, but fear of consequence. Public reaction when the details surfaced was immediate and visceral. Observers were not outraged solely by the unpaid debt. They were disturbed by the timing, by the way this personal conflict intersected with the broader pattern of erasure, by how neatly one man's disappearance aligned with another's immunity. Some called it betrayal, others used harsher language, but a quieter suspicion took hold beneath the anger. That this was not simply about money, but about leverage, about what happens when trust becomes a liability, and when someone realizes they can afford to deny it. The more people examined the sequence of events, the more difficult it became to separate coincidence from design. The loan preceded the isolation. The isolation preceded the collapse. Each step reduced the number of witnesses. Each silence removed a potential intervention. We are often taught to look for villains in moments of violence, but harm is just as often constructed through neglect, through doors that close softly, through calls that are never returned. In this case, the betrayal did not announce itself. It settled in gradually, embedding itself in routine until it felt normal. By the time the consequences became visible, the damage had already been done. And the most unsettling realization was this. The friend who turned away did not act alone. His denial was mirrored by others. His silence echoed across an entire network. No one stepped forward to contradict him. No one offered support, not because they did not care, but because care had become dangerous. This was no longer a story about a loan. It was a demonstration of how quickly a person can be made untouchable, and how easily someone else can be left exposed. The question that followed was inevitable. With so many people present, so many eyes watching, how could this have happened without intervention? The answer did not lie in malice. It lay in fear. And that fear, as others would soon reveal, had been carefully taught. Fear does not emerge spontaneously. It is learned. To understand why no one intervened, why warnings never reached him in time, one must examine the environment in which everyone around him operated. Not a single room, not a single event, but a culture built on observation, humiliation, and memory. Several artists, speaking only after his death, described experiences that followed a similar pattern. The details differed. The outcome did not. One performer recalled an early opportunity that was presented as a career milestone, a formal invitation, a professional setting, the promise of visibility. What followed bore no resemblance to mentorship. In front of peers and colleagues, she was singled out and degraded. Her presence questioned, her worth dismissed. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Their precision was enough. Later that same evening, the setting shifted. A private space. Alcohol introduced without consent. Pressure applied without witnesses willing to intervene. At one point, she was instructed to kneel. The order was delivered calmly, as if it were routine. What froze her was not the command itself, but the expressions around her. No one looked surprised. No one objected. She complied because resistance felt heavier than submission. Another artist shared a different version of the same lesson. A meeting framed as an audition. A dinner that quickly became a test of endurance. Drink after drink placed in front of him, each refusal met with laughter. When his awareness dulled, he was escorted away, isolated from the group. It was only instinct, sharpened by fear, that prompted him to resist and flee. The consequences were immediate. Threats disguised as jokes, promises of retaliation. Only when he made it clear that exposure was an option did the pressure relent. These accounts were not shared for sympathy. They were offered as explanation. In each case, the abuse was not hidden. It was performed, witnessed, allowed. That was the point. Power was demonstrated not through secrecy, but through the certainty that no one would interfere. Over time, these experiences accumulated into an unspoken rule. Observe, endure, forget. Survival depended on remembering what silence could preserve. Within such an environment, helping someone did not require cruelty to be punished. It only required attention. To ask questions was to attract scrutiny. To express concern was to invite risk. The safest position was neutrality, even when neutrality felt like betrayal. When placed against this backdrop, his isolation no longer appeared accidental. It was structural. Those around him may have sensed his distress. Some may have recognized the warning signs. But recognition did not translate into action. Action demanded courage, and courage demanded the willingness to be seen. In this world, visibility was dangerous. This is how fear sustains itself, not through constant violence, but through memory. Everyone remembers the last person who spoke too loudly. Everyone learns from it. By the time his behavior changed, by the time his exhaustion became visible, the system had already done its work. He was alone, not because he was abandoned, but because proximity to him had become a liability. What followed was not indifference. It was calculation. And calculation repeated across enough individuals produces the same outcome as intent. But fear alone does not explain everything. It accounts for silence. It explains inaction. It clarifies why doors remain closed. What it does not explain are the signs he left behind. The details that seem deliberately placed, as if he understood that words would fail where symbols might endure. Those signs would soon demand a different kind of attention. When words fail, symbols remain. In the final months of his life, he left behind details that felt out of place at the time. They were easy to dismiss, too subtle to alarm, too ambiguous to accuse. Only in retrospect did they begin to align, not as evidence, but as intention. In one of his last appearances, a number appeared on the back of his shirt. 4 digits, common, forgettable. Yet to those who noticed, it carried a resonance that extended beyond fashion. In digital language, it signified absence, a page that could not be found, a presence that had been deliberately removed. Whether coincidence or design, it mirrored what would soon happen to his name. Another garment surfaced later, 2 letters stitched above 2 numbers. On their own, they meant nothing. Together they traced a timeline, a beginning, an end. The span of a life compressed into symbols no one thought to question while he was still alive. Some dismissed these interpretations as projection. Others called them coincidence. That debate misses the point. Meaning does not require consensus to exist. It requires recognition. Footage from that period revealed a man moving with effort, his steps measured, his posture guarded. Twice, his hand rose to his face, as if to erase something before it could be seen. These were not performances. They were moments caught between intention and collapse. What followed his death only intensified the unease. The disappearance of records, the refusal to explain, the quiet insistence that nothing was wrong. Each denial amplified the significance of what remained visible. Each attempt to minimize memory made it heavier. In parallel, voices from another realm began to surface. Not investigators, not witnesses, but those who interpret patterns rather than facts. Their language was careful. They spoke of cycles, of unresolved weight, of a spirit unable to settle. Not because it sought vengeance, but because acknowledgement had been withheld. One prediction emerged repeatedly, not a date of exposure but a season of reckoning. A time when accumulated silence would no longer hold, when clarity would arrive, not through confrontation, but through inevitability. Whether one believes in such forecasts is irrelevant. What matters is what they represent. A human need to believe that truth does not vanish simply because it is inconvenient. That time, indifferent and patient, reveals what force attempts to bury. This story is not about assigning blame. It is not about naming villains. It is about recognizing a pattern that extends beyond one individual. A mechanism that rewards quiet compliance and punishes memory. A system that depends on forgetting to function. But forgetting is not guaranteed. As long as questions are asked, even softly. As long as symbols are noticed. As long as names are spoken, even when algorithms refuse them. Erasure remains incomplete. They can remove records. They can alter visibility. They can close conversations. What they cannot do is control remembrance once it has taken root. Because erasure only works when silence wins.